Hey everyone, welcome back to another strange journey through the most bizarre dreams in history. Tonight we're diving into something that'll probably make you question everything you think you know about language, consciousness, and the weird ways our sleeping minds connect us across time and cultures. We're talking about people who found themselves fluently speaking ancient Latin, chattering away in Mandarin they'd never learned, or even babbling in completely lost indigenous languages while fast asleep. And I'm not talking about mumbling random sounds, I'm talking about full conversations, perfect grammar, and vocabulary that would make linguistics professors weep with confusion. So before you settle in with your favorite blanket, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these bizarre historical deep dives. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how these strange stories travel across the globe to reach insomniacs everywhere. Now, get comfortable and prepare to have your mind gently blown by cases so weird that scholars are still scratching their heads centuries later. And hey, if you drift off somewhere in the middle, that's absolutely the point. Though honestly, some of these linguistic mysteries might keep you awake longer than intended. So, picture this, it's 1387 in a tiny farming village outside Canterbury, and a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Whitmore has just woken up his entire family by delivering what sounded like a complete Catholic Mass, in perfect ecclesiastical Latin, and I mean perfect. Not the kind of mangled pronunciation you'd get from someone who'd heard Latin once at Sunday service, but the kind of fluid, confident delivery that would make a Vatican cardinal weep with envy. Now, Thomas had never been to school, never set foot in a cathedral, and the only Latin he'd ever heard was the occasional Ave Maria mumbled by the local priest during Sunday services. This kid spent his days mucking out pig stalls and helping his father harvest barley, not studying ancient languages with scholarly monks. His biggest intellectual challenge before this was remembering which chickens laid eggs where, and suddenly he's conducting religious services in a dead language like he graduated from the University of Paris. But in his dream, Thomas found himself standing at the altar of a magnificent cathedral that made Canterbury look like a village chapel. We're talking about soaring Gothic arches that seemed to disappear into heaven itself, stained glass windows that told biblical stories in colors so vivid they seemed alive, and acoustics so perfect that every word he spoke seemed to be amplified by divine intervention rather than mere architecture. He was wearing elaborate priestly vestments, not the simple brown robes of village clergy, but ornate ceremonial garments made from silk and gold thread, decorated with religious symbols that Thomas somehow understood despite having never seen them before. The vestments felt familiar on his body, as if he'd worn them thousands of times, and he moved through the ritual with the kind of automatic precision that comes from decades of practice. In the dream, Thomas wasn't just mechanically reciting Latin phrases. He was conducting an entire religious service for hundreds of worshippers, including bishops, cardinals, and what appeared to be members of royalty, all dressed in the finest medieval clothing and hanging on his every word. They weren't just passive listeners either. They were participating in responses, singing hymns, and following liturgical cues with the kind of synchronized precision that indicates deep familiarity with complex religious ceremonies. When Thomas woke up, he was still speaking Latin, not random words or phrases, but complete sentences with perfect grammar, complex theological vocabulary, and the kind of fluid pronunciation that scholars spend years trying to master. His parents, William and Margaret Whitmore, were simple farming people who could barely read English, let alone understand what their son was saying as he sat up in bed and delivered what sounded like a formal, religious blessing over their modest cottage. The most unsettling part for Thomas's parents was that their son's voice had changed. Not just his language, but his entire demeanor had transformed. The boy who normally stumbled over simple English sentences when nervous was suddenly speaking with the authority and confidence of someone who had spent his entire life in religious service. His posture was different, his gestures were different, even his facial expressions conveyed a kind of spiritual gravitas that seemed impossible for a 12-year-old farm boy. His parents thought he was possessed by demons, which, let's be honest, was probably the most logical explanation available in 87 for a farm boy, suddenly speaking the language of scholars and saints. Medieval people were quite familiar with stories of demonic possession, and a child suddenly displaying impossible knowledge and abilities fit perfectly into their understanding of how evil spirits might manifest their presence. But this wasn't the kind of violent, disturbing possession described in medieval accounts of demonic influence. Thomas wasn't screaming obscenities or demonstrating supernatural strength or knowledge of people's secret sins. Instead, he was peacefully, almost serenely, discussing complex theological concepts with the kind of gentle authority that suggested divine rather than demonic inspiration. The village priest, Father Benedict, was called to examine Thomas and determine whether they were dealing with divine inspiration, demonic possession, or some kind of psychological breakdown. Father Benedict had received his religious education at a monastery outside London and considered himself reasonably well educated in theological matters. But when he arrived at the Whitmore cottage and found Thomas casually chatting in Latin about the finer points of transubstantiation, he realized he was encountering something that challenged his understanding of how divine revelation worked. Here's where it gets really weird. Thomas wasn't just speaking random Latin phrases or reciting memorized prayers. He was using complex theological vocabulary to discuss interpretations of Scripture that would challenge university-educated clergy, demonstrating knowledge of religious concepts that weren't commonly taught outside of advanced seminary education. He was talking about the difference between various types of sacraments, explaining the theological significance of different liturgical seasons, and even correcting some of Father Benedict's own Latin grammar with the kind of gentle authority that suggested deep scholarly training. When Father Benedict tested Thomas by asking him to explain specific aspects of Catholic doctrine, the boy responded with sophisticated theological arguments that drew on Latin texts and religious authorities that weren't available in English translation and certainly weren't part of popular religious education in rural medieval England. Thomas was quoting from the writings of Augustine, Aquinas, and other church fathers as if he'd spent years studying their works in monastery libraries. But perhaps the strangest part was that Thomas remembered every detail of his cathedral dream with perfect clarity, including the faces of specific clergy members he'd never met and the layout of a church he'd never visited. He could describe the exact pattern of the stained glass windows, the specific design of the altar furnishings, and the particular arrangement of religious symbols that decorated the cathedral walls. When Father Benedict described the dream to colleagues at Canterbury Cathedral, they immediately recognized it as an exact description of a private ordination ceremony that had taken place there 3 years earlier, conducted by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself for a select group of senior clergy from across England. The ceremony had been closed to the public and attended only by high-ranking church officials. Yet Thomas had somehow witnessed and participated in it through his dream, experiencing it with such vivid detail that he could describe things like the specific Latin phrases used in parts of the ceremony that weren't part of standard liturgical practice. Thomas had somehow dreamed his way into a specific historical event, complete with accurate architectural details of Canterbury Cathedral's private ceremonial chambers, correct liturgical procedures that varied from standard practice, and the actual people who had been present at the ordination. And he experienced it all while speaking fluent Latin that he definitely didn't know when he went to sleep, participating in religious discussions that demonstrated theological knowledge that should have taken decades to acquire. The church officials were so baffled that they brought Thomas to Canterbury for examination by scholarly monks who specialized in languages, theology, and the evaluation of claimed divine revelations. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives studying Latin texts and religious doctrine, and they were trained to identify false claims of supernatural knowledge or psychological disturbances that might mimic divine inspiration. For weeks, they tested Thomas with increasingly complex theological questions, challenging him to explain obscure aspects of church doctrine, asking him to translate difficult Latin passages, and requiring him to demonstrate his knowledge of liturgical procedures that weren't commonly known, outside of advanced clerical training. Thomas consistently responded with accuracy and understanding that impressed even the most scholarly monks. What I find absolutely fascinating about Thomas's case is that his Latin wasn't just academically correct. It was specifically the type of ecclesiastical Latin used in 14th century England, complete with regional pronunciation patterns and theological terminology that varied from place to place throughout medieval Europe. It's like his sleeping mind had downloaded not just a language, but a very specific dialect from a very particular time and place, along with the cultural and religious context that gave that language its meaning and significance. The monks discovered that Thomas could distinguish between different types of Latin usage. He knew when to use formal ceremonial language versus conversational ecclesiastical Latin. He understood the difference between scriptural quotations and theological commentary, and he could identify which Latin phrases were appropriate for different parts of religious services. This wasn't just vocabulary memorization. It was sophisticated cultural knowledge that indicated deep immersion in medieval religious education. Thomas's ability gradually faded over several months, like a radio signal growing weaker as atmospheric conditions changed. The monks documented the decline carefully, noting that he first lost his ability to conduct complex theological discussions. Then his vocabulary became more limited, and finally his pronunciation became less precise. By the time he turned 13, he could barely remember basic Latin phrases, and by 14 the language was completely gone from his mind, leaving him unable to understand even simple prayers that he had once delivered with scholarly authority. He spent the rest of his life as an ordinary farmer, with no memory of ever speaking Latin and no understanding of the theological concepts he discussed so fluently in his youth. When people in the village would mention his miraculous year of Latin fluency, Thomas would look at them with complete bewilderment, having no recollection of experiences that had been documented by some of the most educated religious scholars in medieval England. The case was recorded in monastery chronicles and became part of the unofficial collection of miraculous events that medieval churches used to document divine intervention in human affairs. But unlike many medieval miracle stories, Thomas's case was notable for its careful documentation and the attempts by educated clergy to understand and explain what had happened through both theological and what passed for scientific investigation in the 14th century. Sometimes I wonder if our dreams connect us to knowledge that exists somewhere beyond our individual experience and learning, and Thomas just happened to tune into the ecclesiastical Latin frequency for a few months in 1387, receiving not just language but all the cultural and religious understanding that made that language meaningful in medieval Christian civilization. Fast forward to 1923 in San Francisco's bustling Chinatown, where an entirely different and equally baffling linguistic dream phenomenon was unfolding in the modest apartment of Margaret O'Sullivan, an Irish-American woman who had never traveled further west than Sacramento and whose only exposure to Chinese culture was buying vegetables from the local market and occasionally watching the colorful parades during Chinese New Year from a respectful distance. Margaret wasn't a linguist, scholar, or even particularly educated by the standards of her time. She was a practical woman who kept house for her husband Patrick, a dock worker at the San Francisco port, and spent her days managing their small household budget, mending clothes and maintaining the kind of modest but dignified life that working-class Irish immigrants built for themselves in early 20th century America. Her biggest cultural adventure before these dreams was attending Irish folk music performances at the local Catholic church. But starting in the spring of 1923, Margaret's nights became something extraordinary. She began having recurring dreams where she found herself in what appeared to be an ancient Chinese garden that seemed pulled directly from the most exquisite classical scroll paintings. These weren't the simple gardens she'd glimpsed in Chinatown, but elaborate imperial landscapes with stone bridges, arching gracefully over koi ponds that reflected the moon like liquid silver, pavilions with upturned eaves decorated with intricate carvings of dragons and phoenixes, and pathways lined with carefully shaped trees that seemed to have been growing in perfect harmony for centuries. In these dreams, the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood incense, and Margaret found herself surrounded by people in traditional Chinese robes, not the simple work clothes of Chinatown immigrants, but the elaborate silk garments of imperial courtiers, scholars, and noble families. The colors were more vivid than anything she'd experienced in her waking life. Jade greens that seemed to glow with inner light, crimson reds that pulsed like living fire, and golds that caught moonlight as if they were made of actual precious metal rather than fabric. What made these dreams truly extraordinary was Margaret's complete fluency in the language of this dream world, not just any Chinese, but what scholars would later identify as classical Chinese. The sophisticated literary language used in imperial courts and by educated elites for over 1,000 years. She wasn't struggling to understand or fumbling for words. She was participating in complex conversations about philosophy, poetry, family relationships, and spiritual concepts with the natural ease of someone who had spoken the language since childhood. But this wasn't modern conversational Mandarin that a tourist might pick up. Margaret was discussing sophisticated Confucian concepts about social harmony and individual virtue, debating Taoist principles about the relationship between humanity and nature, and even engaging in literary criticism of classical Chinese poetry, using vocabulary and grammatical structures that would challenge professional translators and academic specialists. When Margaret woke up from these dreams, she would continue speaking fluent Mandarin for several minutes before her normal English consciousness returned, often leaving her husband Patrick staring in bewilderment as his Irish wife delivered what sounded like formal speeches in a language she'd never studied. Even more mysteriously, she began producing Chinese calligraphy on scraps of paper, not random marks or copied characters, but beautifully formed text with proper stroke order and elegant, stylistic flourishes that indicated formal training in traditional Chinese writing arts. The calligraphy wasn't just technically correct, it was artistically sophisticated, showing the kind of personal style and emotional expression that develops after years of practice. Margaret would write complete poems, philosophical observations, and personal reflections in characters that she couldn't read or understand when she examined them later in her waking state. The writing flowed from her brush with natural rhythm and confidence, as if her hand had been trained in Chinese calligraphy since childhood. Patrick initially thought his wife was having some kind of nervous breakdown, especially when she started discussing Chinese philosophical concepts during breakfast conversations without seeming to realize she was mixing languages and cultural frameworks that had nothing to do with their Irish Catholic background. He worried that the stress of immigrant life and the isolation of being far from family in Ireland might be causing some kind of psychological crisis. But when Margaret began producing pages of Chinese, writing and speaking with what sounded like authentic pronunciation and complex grammar, Patrick realized they were dealing with something that went beyond conventional psychological explanation. Desperate for answers and hoping to find someone who could explain what was happening to his wife, he swallowed his pride and sought out Dr. Liu Wei, a respected Chinese physician and cultural historian who served the Chinatown community. Dr. Liu Wei was a remarkable man who had received classical Chinese education in Beijing before immigrating to America in the early 1900s. He was fluent in both classical and modern Chinese, deeply versed in traditional Chinese philosophy and literature, and experienced in serving as a cultural bridge between Chinese immigrants and American society. When Patrick brought Margaret to see him, Dr. Liu expected to encounter either a psychological disturbance or perhaps some kind of elaborate cultural appropriation. Instead, he found himself listening to an Irish-American woman speaking classical Chinese with a sophistication that rivaled his own education. Margaret wasn't just producing random phrases or imitating sounds she'd overheard. She was engaging in complex discussions about the differences between various schools of Confucian thought, analyzing the symbolic meanings in Tang Dynasty poetry, and demonstrating knowledge of Chinese, cultural practices that weren't commonly known even among educated Chinese immigrants. Dr. Liu was particularly astonished by Margaret's pronunciation, which included tonal patterns and regional inflections that matched speakers from specific historical periods and geographical regions of China. She wasn't speaking with the accent of contemporary Chinatown residents, but with pronunciation patterns that reflected the way classical Chinese had been spoken in imperial courts during the Tang and Song dynasties, complete with archaic tonal variations that had been lost to most modern speakers. When Dr. Liu tested Margaret's knowledge by asking her to discuss specific Chinese philosophical concepts, She responded with sophisticated analyses that drew on multiple classical sources, comparing different interpretations of key texts and even identifying subtle differences between various schools of thought that required deep scholarly training to understand. She could quote from the Analects of Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, and the I Ching with perfect accuracy, using traditional commentaries and interpretations that weren't available in English translation. But perhaps most remarkably, Margaret's Chinese wasn't just academically correct, it was culturally authentic. She understood not just the words and grammar, but the social contexts, the proper forms of address for different relationships, the ceremonial language used in various religious and cultural practices, and the subtle implications of word choices that reflected deep familiarity with Chinese social structure and cultural values. Dr. Liu became so fascinated by Margaret's case that he began documenting her linguistic episodes in detail, recording her conversations and collecting samples of her calligraphy to submit for analysis by academic experts. He contacted Professor James Chun at UC Berkeley, one of the leading scholars of classical Chinese in America, and asked him to examine Margaret's productions without revealing the unusual circumstances of their creation. Professor Chun's analysis confirmed Dr. Liu's initial assessment. Margaret was demonstrating knowledge of classical Chinese. That would normally require decades of intensive study with traditional Chinese scholars. Her calligraphy showed technical proficiency and artistic sensitivity that indicated formal training in traditional Chinese writing arts. And her spoken Chinese included archaic vocabulary and grammatical constructions that weren't taught even in advanced university courses. But the mystery deepened when Professor Chun realized that some of Margaret's poetry recitations were verses from Tang Dynasty poets like Li Bai and Du Fu that weren't widely known even among Chinese literature specialists. She was reciting obscure works with perfect tonal patterns and traditional rhythmic structures, including variations and interpretations that suggested familiarity with manuscript traditions that existed only in specialized academic collections. Even more puzzling, Margaret described her dream garden with such specific detail that Dr. Liu's elderly father, who had grown up in the Forbidden City before immigrating to America, immediately recognized it as an accurate description of the imperial palace gardens where he had played as a child. Margaret had somehow dreamed her way into spaces that weren't accessible to Westerners and weren't documented in any publications available to her. Margaret's dream conversations weren't random or superficial. They were deep, meaningful exchanges about the nature of wisdom, the relationship between individual and society, the spiritual significance of nature, and the proper way to live a virtuous life. She discussed these concepts with the kind of nuanced understanding that comes from lifelong immersion in Chinese philosophical traditions, using metaphors and examples that reflected authentic Chinese cultural perspectives. As Margaret's Chinese dream episodes continued over the course of about 2 years, Dr. Liu and Professor Chun documented what they came to consider one of the most remarkable cases of linguistic and cultural knowledge acquisition they had ever encountered. Margaret produced hundreds of pages of Chinese calligraphy, hours of recorded conversation, and detailed descriptions of Chinese cultural practices that contributed significantly to academic understanding of traditional Chinese civilization. The most haunting aspect of Margaret's experience was that her Chinese dreams were accompanied by a complete transformation of consciousness. During her dream episodes and immediately upon waking, she didn't just speak Chinese, she thought like someone who had been raised in traditional Chinese culture. Her perspectives on family relationships, social obligations, spiritual practices, and personal values reflected authentically Chinese worldviews that were completely different from her Irish Catholic background. Margaret would discuss concepts like filial piety, the mandate of heaven, the importance of harmony between opposing forces, and the spiritual significance of natural phenomena with the kind of deep understanding that comes from growing up within these cultural frameworks. She wasn't just using Chinese words to express Irish-American ideas. She was accessing fundamentally different ways of understanding reality and human experience. Dr. Liu noted that Margaret's Chinese personality was distinctly different from her English-speaking self. In Chinese, she was more formal, more contemplative, more attuned to subtle social dynamics and hierarchical relationships. She used different patterns of reasoning, different emotional expressions, and different approaches to problem solving that reflected authentic Chinese cultural values and social practices. The gradual fading of Margaret's Chinese abilities was as mysterious as their appearance. Over the course of several months, her vocabulary became more limited, her pronunciation less precise, and her cultural knowledge more superficial. Eventually, she retained only fragments of Chinese phrases and no understanding of the philosophical concepts she had discussed so eloquently. By 1925, Margaret had returned to her normal life as a monolingual English speaker with no conscious memory of her Chinese dream experiences and no ability to read or understand the hundreds of pages of calligraphy she had produced. She kept all the Chinese writing, even though it looked like meaningless symbols to her, and she would sometimes stare at the beautiful characters with a vague sense that they had once meant something important to her. Margaret lived to be 93 years old and never learned to speak Chinese in her waking life, but the archive of her dream language productions remains at UC. Berkeley is one of the most extensively documented cases of spontaneous linguistic ability in academic literature. Scholars continue to study her calligraphy and recordings as examples of authentic, classical Chinese produced under circumstances that challenge conventional understanding of how language acquisition works. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret's story suggests that cultural knowledge and linguistic ability might exist in forms that transcend individual learning and cultural boundaries, accessible through states of consciousness that we don't yet understand. Maybe the boundaries between different cultural traditions are more permeable than we think, and our sleeping minds can occasionally cross those boundaries to experience other ways of being human. Now let's talk about Father Giuseppe Benedetti, an Italian Catholic priest who in 1956 started having dreams where he found himself chanting in perfect Sanskrit, a language he'd never studied and frankly had no reason to know. Given that he was a simple parish priest in rural Tuscany whose main concerns were baptisms, weddings, and making sure the church roof didn't leak during the region's notorious autumn storms. Father Giuseppe was the kind of priest you'd find in countless small Italian villages, devout, practical, and thoroughly dedicated to his local community. He had been ordained in 1935 after studying at a modest seminary in Florence, where his education focused on Latin liturgy, basic theology, and the practical aspects of parish management rather than comparative religion or Eastern philosophy. His world revolved around the daily rhythms of Catholic life, morning mass, confession, visits to sick parishioners, and the endless administrative tasks that keep a small church functioning. The village of San Gimignano, where Father Giuseppe served, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where traditions hadn't changed significantly for centuries, and where the most exotic foreign influence was the occasional tourist who wandered off the main road to Florence. The local people were farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who lived simple lives guided by the same Catholic faith their ancestors had practiced for over 1,000 years. But starting on a crisp October evening in 1956, Father Giuseppe's nights became something extraordinary and deeply troubling. He began having recurring dreams where he found himself in what appeared to be a massive Hindu temple complex that made the grandest European cathedrals look modest by comparison. These weren't simple dreams about foreign places. They were immersive experiences where Father Giuseppe lived as a Hindu priest, participating in elaborate religious ceremonies and speaking fluent Sanskrit with the same natural ease he used Italian in his waking life. The temple in his dreams was unlike anything Father Giuseppe had ever seen or imagined. Towering stone structures covered with intricate carvings of gods and goddesses stretched toward the sky, their surfaces decorated with thousands of figures engaged in cosmic dances, battles between good and evil, and scenes from mythological stories that Father Giuseppe somehow understood despite having never studied Hindu literature. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood incense, marigold garlands, and the smoke from ceremonial fires that burned continuously in various chambers throughout the complex. In these dreams, Father Giuseppe wasn't confused or out of place. He was completely at home, wearing traditional Hindu priestly garments, saffron-colored robes wrapped in precise traditional patterns, sacred thread across his chest, and ritual markings on his forehead that he applied with practiced expertise. He moved through the temple complex with the confident familiarity of someone who had spent his entire life within these sacred spaces, knowing exactly where each ritual object belonged and understanding the significance of every ceremonial procedure. But perhaps most remarkably, Father Giuseppe was participating in elaborate religious ceremonies while chanting in perfect Sanskrit, not just random syllables or memorized phrases, but sophisticated hymns, prayers, and ritual formulas that demonstrated deep understanding of Hindu theology and spiritual practices. He was conducting fire ceremonies, leading group meditations, and delivering religious discourses that drew on complex philosophical concepts from various schools of Hindu thought. When Father Giuseppe woke up from these dreams, he was still chanting in Sanskrit, not just random sounds, but actual verses from ancient Hindu scriptures like the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. His housekeeper, Maria, would find him in his study at 3 in the morning, sitting cross-legged on the floor in a meditation posture that looked nothing like Catholic prayer, reciting what sounded like religious incantations in a language she'd never heard before. This created something of a theological crisis for Father Giuseppe. Here he was, a devoted Catholic priest who had dedicated his life to serving Christ and the Catholic Church, somehow channeling knowledge of a completely different religious tradition that he'd never studied or even shown interest in. He started questioning whether he was experiencing divine revelation, demonic temptation, or some kind of psychological breakdown that was threatening his faith and his vocation. The situation became even more complicated when Father Giuseppe started writing in Sanskrit during his post-dream episodes. These weren't random scribblings or copied symbols. They were actual passages from sacred Hindu texts, written in perfect Devanagari script by a man who had never seen Sanskrit writing before. The handwriting was elegant and confident, showing the kind of calligraphic skill that typically requires years of practice with traditional writing instruments and techniques. But what made Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit writing truly extraordinary was that he wasn't just copying well-known texts. He was producing original compositions, prayers, philosophical meditations, and theological commentaries that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Hindu spiritual concepts and religious practices. He was writing about dharma, righteous duty, karma, the law of cause and effect, moksha, spiritual liberation, and other fundamental concepts of Hindu philosophy with the kind of nuanced understanding that would impress professional scholars. The content of Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit writings revealed knowledge that went far beyond what any European priest could have acquired through casual study. He was discussing subtle differences between various schools of Hindu philosophy, analyzing complex interpretations of sacred texts, and even commenting on regional variations in ritual practices that weren't documented in Western academic sources. His writing showed the kind of insider knowledge that comes from living within Hindu culture rather than studying it from the outside. Desperate for answers and increasingly concerned about his spiritual and mental health, Father Giuseppe contacted Professor Raj Mehta at the University of Rome, one of Europe's leading Sanskrit scholars who had immigrated from India to teach comparative religion and Hindu philosophy. Professor Mehta was initially skeptical. He received frequent requests from Europeans who claimed to have mystical experiences with Eastern religions, and most of these cases involved superficial knowledge mixed with wishful thinking. But when Professor Mehta examined Father Giuseppe's writings and listened to recordings of his Sanskrit chanting, he was absolutely flabbergasted. The priest was demonstrating knowledge of Sanskrit that rivaled Professor Mehta's own expertise, using grammatical structures and vocabulary that indicated extensive training in traditional Hindu education systems. The pronunciation was perfect, including subtle tonal variations and rhythmic patterns that are typically learned only through direct instruction from qualified gurus. More importantly, Father Giuseppe wasn't just reciting well-known Sanskrit prayers or copying famous texts. He was producing variations and interpretations of classical Hindu scriptures that showed deep understanding of theological concepts and spiritual practices. His commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita revealed insights that Professor Mehta found genuinely valuable for his own scholarly work, and his interpretations of Upanishadic philosophy demonstrated the kind of spiritual understanding that typically requires decades of meditation and study. Professor Mehta became so fascinated that he started having regular sessions with Father Giuseppe, documenting his Sanskrit knowledge and trying to understand how a Catholic priest could possess such extensive understanding of Hindu sacred literature. The sessions revealed that Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit wasn't just academically correct, it was spiritually profound, demonstrating the kind of deep religious understanding that comes from years of spiritual practice and direct mystical experience. But here's where Father Giuseppe's story becomes really complex and troubling from a theological perspective. His Sanskrit dreams weren't just giving him knowledge of Hindu language and literature, they were fundamentally changing his understanding of Christian faith and his approach to Catholic pastoral work. The Hindu concepts he was accessing in his dreams started influencing his homilies, his counseling of parishioners, and his personal spiritual practices in ways that created significant tension with traditional Catholic doctrine. Father Giuseppe began incorporating ideas about reincarnation, karma, and the ultimate unity of all religions into his Sunday sermons, suggesting that Catholic salvation and Hindu moksha might be different paths toward the same spiritual goal. He started teaching meditation techniques that resembled Hindu practices more than traditional Catholic contemplation, and he began emphasizing the importance of direct spiritual experience over doctrinal adherence in ways that made his bishop deeply uncomfortable. The most disturbing aspect for Father Giuseppe was that his Sanskrit dreams were revealing spiritual truths that seemed to contradict some fundamental Catholic teachings. He was experiencing visions of cosmic consciousness where individual souls merged with universal divine essence, learning about cycles of death and rebirth that challenged Christian beliefs about final judgment and eternal life, and accessing philosophical frameworks that suggested all religions were ultimately expressions of the same underlying spiritual reality. This created an intense internal conflict for Father Giuseppe. On one hand, his Sanskrit dream experiences felt more spiritually authentic and transformative than anything he had encountered in his Catholic education and practice. On the other hand, he had devoted his life to Catholic priesthood and felt genuine loyalty to the church that had shaped his identity and vocation. He was torn between honoring the spiritual insights he was receiving through his dreams and maintaining fidelity to the religious tradition he had sworn to serve. His bishop, Monsignor Alberti, initially dismissed the Sanskrit episodes as psychological stress related to the isolation and challenges of rural parish work. But when Father Giuseppe started demonstrating extensive knowledge of Hindu philosophy and began incorporating non-Christian concepts into his pastoral work, the church hierarchy began taking the situation more seriously. They brought in theologians, linguists, and medical experts to examine what they privately began calling the Sanskrit priest phenomenon. The investigation revealed that Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit knowledge was so extensive and accurate that it would have required decades of intensive study with traditional Hindu gurus in India. Yet he had never traveled outside Italy, never studied Eastern religions, and had never shown any interest in non-Christian spiritual traditions before these dreams began. The depth and authenticity of his knowledge couldn't be explained through any conventional understanding of how language and cultural knowledge are acquired. Church officials were particularly concerned about the theological implications of Father Giuseppe's experiences. If a Catholic priest could receive authentic knowledge of Hindu scripture and philosophy through dreams, what did this suggest about the relationship between different religious traditions? Did it mean that all religions contained valid spiritual insights, or was Father Giuseppe being deceived by spiritual forces that were leading him away from Christian truth? The situation became even more complicated when Professor Mehta arranged for Father Giuseppe to meet with traditional Hindu scholars and spiritual teachers who were visiting Italy. These meetings revealed that Father Giuseppe's understanding of Hindu philosophy wasn't just academically correct, it was spiritually mature, showing the kind of wisdom and insight that Hindu tradition associates with advanced practitioners who have achieved significant spiritual realization. One elderly Swami from Rishikesh told Professor Mehta that conversing with Father Giuseppe was like talking to a fellow spiritual teacher who had spent lifetimes studying and practicing Hindu Dharma. The Swami said that Father Giuseppe's questions and insights revealed understanding of subtle spiritual principles that even many Hindu priests never fully grasp, and that his approach to meditation and spiritual practice showed genuine mastery of traditional Hindu techniques. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit abilities was their temporary nature. After about 18 months of intense dream experiences, the episodes began to fade gradually. His Sanskrit vocabulary became more limited, his pronunciation less precise, and his understanding of Hindu philosophical concepts more superficial. It was as if his access to this vast reservoir of spiritual knowledge was slowly being withdrawn. The decline of Father Giuseppe's Sanskrit abilities was carefully documented by Professor Mehta and the church investigators. They noted that he first lost his ability to produce original Sanskrit compositions. Then his comprehension of complex philosophical texts became more limited, and finally his pronunciation began to show the kind of errors that would be expected from someone who had learned Sanskrit as a foreign language rather than as a native spiritual tongue. By early 1958, Father Giuseppe retained only basic Sanskrit vocabulary and no understanding of the Hindu philosophical concepts he had discussed so eloquently during his dream episodes. He was unable to read the Sanskrit texts he had written during his mystical period, and he had no memory of the spiritual insights that had so profoundly influenced his approach to Catholic ministry. The experience left Father Giuseppe permanently changed, even after his Sanskrit abilities had completely disappeared. He continued to emphasize interfaith dialogue and mystical spirituality in his pastoral work, though he did so within acceptable Catholic frameworks rather than through explicit references to Hindu philosophy. He became known throughout the region as a priest who had unusual spiritual depth and insight, though few people understood the source of his transformed perspective. Father Giuseppe served his rural parish for another 30 years, never again experiencing Sanskrit dreams or demonstrating knowledge of Hindu philosophy. But colleagues and parishioners noted that his approach to spirituality retained something indefinable that seemed to come from direct mystical experience rather than merely theological education. He had somehow been touched by something that expanded his understanding of the sacred, even though the specific knowledge that had produced this transformation had been withdrawn. Professor Mehta published several academic papers about Father Giuseppe's case, describing it as one of the most remarkable examples of spontaneous linguistic and cultural knowledge acquisition in scholarly literature. The Sanskrit texts that Father Giuseppe had produced during his dream episodes continued to be studied by Hindu scholars as examples of authentic spiritual insight expressed in classical Sanskrit by someone who had no logical way of acquiring such knowledge. Sometimes I wonder if Father Giuseppe's story suggests that spiritual truth might be more universal than we usually assume, and that the boundaries between different religious traditions might be more permeable than conventional theology suggests. Maybe consciousness can occasionally access forms of knowledge and understanding that transcend the cultural and religious frameworks we think define the limits of human spiritual experience. In 1978, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a linguistics professor at the University of Sydney, experienced something that challenged everything she thought she knew about language acquisition, cultural transmission, and the nature of human consciousness. And this is particularly remarkable because Elizabeth was about as far from indigenous Australian experience as you could get, white, middle-class academic living in urban Sydney with no connection to traditional Aboriginal communities and no particular interest in indigenous languages or culture. Elizabeth Morrison was a specialist in European languages, French, German, Italian, the kind of scholarly linguist who spent her days analyzing Romance language phonetic shifts and Germanic grammatical structures. Her office at the university was filled with dusty volumes of comparative European linguistics, and her idea of fieldwork was examining medieval manuscripts in European libraries, rather than recording indigenous languages in remote Australian communities. She was methodical, rational, and thoroughly committed to evidence-based scholarship. Her colleagues respected her for her rigorous approach to linguistic analysis and her ability to identify subtle patterns in language evolution that other researchers missed. She published papers with titles like Phonological Variations in Medieval Provençal Poetry and The Influence of Germanic Substrates on Romance, Language Development. Not exactly the kind of work that would prepare someone for sudden fluency in Aboriginal Australian languages. But starting in the winter of 1978, Elizabeth began having dreams that transported her to the Australian outback in ways that felt more real than her normal waking life. These weren't casual dreams about traveling or vague impressions of different landscapes. Elizabeth found herself fully immersed in the ancient red earth country of Central Australia, standing beneath vast starry skies that seemed to contain more stars than she'd ever imagined possible, surrounded by the distinctive rock formations and ghost gum trees that define the heart of the continent. In these dreams, Elizabeth wasn't speaking English. She was conversing fluently in what she later discovered was a dialect of the Arenti language spoken by Aboriginal people in Central Australia, a language that was considered endangered even in 1978, spoken by fewer than a few hundred people and rarely encountered by non-Aboriginal Australians. Elizabeth had never studied Arenti, had never heard it spoken extensively, and certainly had never shown any interest in Aboriginal languages or culture. But in her dreams, Elizabeth wasn't just speaking Arenti. She was living as part of an Aboriginal community with complete cultural fluency. She knew her place in complex kinship systems, understood traditional ecological knowledge about plants and animals, participated in ceremonial activities with appropriate respect and understanding, and demonstrated knowledge of sacred stories and cultural practices that weren't commonly shared outside Aboriginal communities. The most extraordinary aspect of Elizabeth's dream experiences was the depth of cultural knowledge that came with the language. She wasn't just speaking Arenti words, she was understanding the worldview, the spiritual concepts, and the complex relationship between language, land, and identity that forms the foundation of Aboriginal culture. In her dreams, she had a name, a pari, and a specific role within the community structure that came with responsibilities, relationships, and cultural knowledge that Elizabeth's waking mind had never encountered. Elizabeth would wake up from these dreams speaking fragments of Arenti, using grammatical structures and vocabulary that she couldn't consciously understand. Her husband, also a linguistics professor, started recording these episodes because he recognized that his wife was demonstrating knowledge of a language system that was completely outside her area of expertise and professional experience. What made the situation even more remarkable was that Elizabeth's dream Arenti wasn't just conversational language, it included ceremonial speech patterns, traditional storytelling formulas, and specialized vocabulary related to sacred sites and spiritual practices that weren't commonly known even among Aboriginal people who had grown up in urban areas away from traditional communities. The linguistic complexity of Elizabeth's Arenti was extraordinary. She was using grammatical structures that indicated deep familiarity with the language's intricate system of kinship terms, directional markers, and cultural categories that require years of immersion to master. She could distinguish between different types of ceremonial language, understood the proper terms of address for various social relationships, and demonstrated knowledge of traditional ecological terminology that reflected detailed understanding of Central Australian environments. Realizing that something unprecedented was happening, Elizabeth contacted Professor Albert Namatjira Jr., son of the famous Aboriginal artist, who was working with the Institute for Aboriginal Development to preserve Arenti language and culture. When Professor Namatjira heard recordings of Elizabeth's sleep-talking, he was stunned. She was speaking his ancestral language with an accuracy and cultural understanding that surpassed many Aboriginal people who had grown up in urban areas without access to traditional language education. Professor Namatjira arranged for Elizabeth to meet with elderly Arenti speakers in Alice Springs, and what happened next was both beautiful and profoundly moving. The elders immediately recognized that Elizabeth was accessing traditional language, patterns and cultural knowledge that had been passed down through generations of their people, but that was increasingly rare even among younger Aboriginal community members. Elder Tommy Lewis, a respected keeper of traditional knowledge, told Professor Namajira that listening to Elizabeth speak was like hearing his grandmother's voice again, because she was using pronunciation patterns and storytelling rhythms that were characteristic of Iraqi speakers from earlier generations, who had learned the language before European contact had influenced its development. But here's where Elizabeth's story becomes almost mystical. The elders told her that some of the specific stories and songs she was reciting in her dreams were traditional narratives that hadn't been shared outside their community for decades. She was somehow accessing cultural memory that existed only in the minds and hearts of a few elderly Iraqi speakers who had learned these stories from their grandparents and great-grandparents. One particularly moving session occurred when Elizabeth, while in a post-dream state, began singing a traditional lullaby that Elder Mary Dixon hadn't heard since her own childhood in the 1920s. The song included verses and melodic variations that Mary's mother had sung to her, but that had never been recorded or documented by anthropologists or linguists. Elizabeth was somehow accessing intimate family cultural memory that existed only in the recollections of a few elderly women. The Iraqi elders weren't surprised by Elizabeth's abilities in the way that Western academics were. In their worldview, the dreamtime connections between people, places, and ancestral knowledge can manifest in ways that European science doesn't readily understand or acknowledge. They saw Elizabeth's experiences as evidence that the old stories and languages are still alive in the spiritual landscape of Australia, accessible to people whose consciousness becomes attuned to these deeper cultural currents. Elder Tommy Lewis explained to Professor Namajira that in traditional Aboriginal understanding, country and language are inseparable. The land itself holds cultural knowledge and linguistic patterns that can be accessed by people who develop the right kind of spiritual relationship with place. Elizabeth's dream suggested that she had somehow developed this kind of connection to Central Australian country, allowing her to access the language and cultural knowledge that are embedded in the landscape itself. The most profound aspect of Elizabeth's experience was that her dreams weren't just about language, they were about connection to country, understanding of traditional ecological knowledge, and spiritual relationship with the Australian landscape that fundamentally changed her understanding of human consciousness and cultural transmission. She was learning how to read the subtle signs that indicate water sources, seasonal changes, and the behavior patterns of native animals in ways that reflected thousands of years of accumulated Aboriginal knowledge. Elizabeth described experiencing the landscape from an Aboriginal perspective, seeing the country as a living cultural text filled with stories, songs, and spiritual significance rather than as the empty wilderness that most non-Aboriginal Australians perceive when they look at the outback. Her dreams were teaching her to understand the intricate relationships between geographical features, seasonal cycles, and cultural practices that form the foundation of Aboriginal connection to country. The collaboration between Elizabeth and the Iraqi elders resulted in one of the most comprehensive recordings of traditional Iraqi language and culture ever created by academic researchers. Elizabeth's dream knowledge provided access to linguistic patterns, cultural practices, and traditional stories that had been preserved only in the memories of elderly community members, and her work with the elders helped document this knowledge for future generations. But perhaps most importantly, Elizabeth's experience challenged conventional academic approaches to indigenous languages and cultures. Her dream access to Iraqi demonstrated that cultural knowledge and linguistic competence might exist in forms that transcend individual learning and formal education, accessible through states of consciousness that Western science doesn't yet understand. The elders who worked with Elizabeth emphasized that her experience wasn't unique or supernatural from their perspective. It was simply an example of how cultural knowledge and spiritual connection can manifest. When people develop appropriate relationships with country and community, they suggested that Elizabeth's academic work with European languages had somehow prepared her consciousness to receive traditional Aboriginal knowledge, as if her professional sensitivity to linguistic patterns had opened channels for accessing other forms of human language and cultural understanding. Elizabeth's Iraqi dream episodes continued for about a year, during which she worked closely with Aboriginal elders to document the traditional language patterns and cultural knowledge she was accessing. This collaboration contributed significantly to Arenti language preservation efforts and provided insights into traditional Aboriginal culture that weren't available through conventional anthropological research methods. When her dream language abilities eventually faded, Elizabeth had been permanently changed by the experience. She shifted her entire academic career to focus on indigenous Australian languages and became one of the leading advocates for Aboriginal language preservation and cultural recognition in Australia. Her experience had taught her that language isn't just an abstract system of communication, it's a living connection to cultural knowledge, spiritual understanding, and relationship with country that carries the wisdom and identity of entire peoples. The Aboriginal community members who worked with Elizabeth said that her experience demonstrated the continuing vitality of traditional knowledge and the possibility for genuine cross-cultural understanding that respects indigenous perspectives and worldviews. They weren't surprised by her linguistic abilities. In their understanding, the old languages and stories are always present in the country, waiting for people who develop the capacity to hear and understand them. Elizabeth often reflected that her Arenti dream experiences had taught her more about the nature of language and human consciousness than decades of conventional academic study. She learned that linguistic competence isn't just about vocabulary and grammar, it's about cultural identity, spiritual connection, and the deep relationships between people, place, and knowledge that make language meaningful and alive. Her case remains one of the most extensively documented examples of spontaneous indigenous language acquisition in academic literature, and it continues to challenge conventional understanding of how cultural knowledge is transmitted and preserved. Elizabeth's story suggests that the boundaries between different cultural traditions might be more permeable than Western academic frameworks typically acknowledge, and that human consciousness might have access to forms of knowledge and understanding that exist beyond individual experience and formal education. Sometimes I think Elizabeth's story reminds us that indigenous knowledge systems offer profound insights into the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to land, language, and cultural memory that Western science is only beginning to understand and appreciate. Our next case takes us to 1982 and involves Michael Thompson, a construction worker from Detroit who had never shown any interest in ancient history, archaeology, or languages, unless you count his ability to swear creatively in English when his football team was losing, which honestly was a linguistic skill all its own, but not exactly what you'd call scholarly preparation for ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Michael was about as far from an Egyptologist as you could imagine: union electrician, weekend bowler, guy whose idea of ancient culture was watching the occasional mummy movie on late-night TV when he couldn't sleep after a particularly tough day, wrestling with industrial wiring. He could barely spell pharaoh, let alone read hieroglyphics or understand ancient Egyptian religious concepts. His biggest intellectual challenge was figuring out which drill bit to use for different types of concrete, and his most profound cultural experience was arguing about Detroit Lions statistics at the local bar. But in the spring of 1982, Michael started having incredibly vivid dreams where he found himself in ancient Egypt, not as a tourist or observer, but as a working scribe in what appeared to be a massive temple complex that made the most impressive modern buildings look like garden sheds. These weren't casual dreams about exotic places. They were immersive experiences where Michael lived and worked as an ancient Egyptian temple scribe, fluently reading and writing hieroglyphics and demonstrating detailed knowledge of ancient Egyptian theology, social structure, and daily life. The temple in Michael's dreams was unlike anything he'd ever seen or imagined, even in Hollywood movies. Towering stone columns covered with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions stretched toward ceilings that seemed to disappear into shadows, while massive statues of gods and pharaohs lined corridors that stretched for what felt like miles. The walls were covered with painted scenes that told stories of creation, death, rebirth, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos, all rendered in colors so vivid they seemed to pulse with divine energy. In these dreams, Michael wasn't confused or out of place. He was completely at home, wearing traditional Egyptian scribal clothing, linen kilts, sandals, and the kind of precise jewelry that indicated his status as an educated temple official. He carried himself with the confident bearing of someone who had spent years mastering the complex skills required for temple administration, and he moved through the sacred spaces with the automatic familiarity that comes from daily routine. But perhaps most remarkably, Michael was fluently reading and writing hieroglyphics, not just simple pictographs or tourist-level symbols, but sophisticated religious texts that required mastery of the complex Egyptian writing system. He understood the difference between ideograms that represented concepts, phonograms that indicated sounds, and determinatives that clarified meaning. He could read both formal monumental hieroglyphics carved in stone and the more cursive hieratic script used for daily administrative work. The dreams were so realistic that Michael would wake up with his hands cramped as if he'd been writing for hours, and he could remember every detail of the hieroglyphic texts he'd been working on in his sleep. He started sketching the symbols he remembered from his dreams, creating pages of hieroglyphic writing that looked authentic but meant nothing to him in his waking state. The writing wasn't random or copied from memory. It was original composition that showed sophisticated understanding of Egyptian grammar, religious concepts, and cultural practices. Michael's wife, Linda, thought he was having some kind of midlife crisis, especially when he started talking about ancient Egyptian gods, mummification processes, and temple architecture during breakfast. This was a guy whose previous idea of deep conversation was arguing about whether the Lions would ever win a playoff game, and suddenly he was discussing the theological significance of the god, Ptah, and the proper procedures for preparing sacred offerings. The situation became more serious when Michael started producing not just random hieroglyphic symbols, but actual texts, complete inscriptions with proper grammar, religious formulas, and cultural references that indicated sophisticated knowledge of ancient Egyptian civilization. He was writing prayers to specific deities, administrative documents that followed authentic bureaucratic formulas, and even poetry that used traditional Egyptian literary structures and metaphors. Concerned about her husband's mental health and hoping to find some rational explanation for his sudden obsession with ancient Egypt, Linda convinced Michael to see Dr. Sarah Cohen, a psychiatrist who specialized in unusual psychological phenomena. Dr. Cohen expected to find either stress-related fantasy or perhaps some kind of dissociative episode related to the pressures of blue-collar work in economically challenging Detroit. Instead, she found herself examining hieroglyphic writings that appeared to be authentic ancient Egyptian texts produced by a construction worker, who insisted he had no conscious knowledge of Egyptian history or language. Dr. Cohen had enough background in cross-cultural psychology to recognize that Michael's productions weren't random or improvised. They showed consistent internal logic and cultural authenticity that suggested genuine knowledge rather than psychological fantasy. Realizing that she was dealing with something beyond conventional psychiatric explanation, Dr. Cohen contacted Professor James Whitfield at the University of Michigan, one of the leading Egyptologists in the United States. Professor Whitfield agreed to examine Michael's writings as a favor to Dr. Cohen, expecting to find amateur attempts at hieroglyphic writing that might reveal interesting psychological patterns but wouldn't have any serious linguistic or historical value. Instead, Professor Whitfield found authentic hieroglyphic texts written in classical Middle Egyptian, demonstrating knowledge of grammar, vocabulary, and cultural concepts that would require years of graduate-level study to acquire. Michael was producing religious inscriptions, administrative documents, and even poetry in a form of ancient Egyptian that hadn't been spoken for over 2,000 years, and he was doing it with accuracy that rivaled professional Egyptologists. But here's the really incredible part. Michael wasn't just copying well-known hieroglyphic texts from museums or books. He was creating original compositions that showed deep understanding of ancient Egyptian literary forms, religious concepts, and social structures. His dream writings included references to specific deities, temple procedures, and cultural practices that weren't commonly known even among professional Egyptologists who specialized in Egyptian religion and society. Professor Whitfield became so intrigued that he started working with Michael regularly, documenting his hieroglyphic productions and trying to understand how a construction worker could demonstrate such extensive knowledge of ancient Egyptian civilization. The collaboration revealed that Michael's knowledge wasn't just academically correct, it was culturally authentic, showing the kind of deep understanding that comes from living within ancient Egyptian society rather than just studying it from the outside. Michael described his dreams with remarkable consistency and detail. He was always the same character, a temple scribe named Kamwasit, who worked in the temple of Ptah in Memphis during the reign of Ramesses II, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. He could describe the daily routines of temple life, the hierarchies among priests and scribes, the specific procedures for various religious ceremonies, and the administrative systems that kept the great temples functioning as centers of religious, economic, and political power. In his dreams, Michael understood not just the Egyptian language, but the entire cultural context that gave that language meaning. He knew the proper forms of address for different social ranks, the ceremonial language used in various religious rituals, the specialized vocabulary related to different crafts and professions, and the complex theological concepts that shaped Egyptian understanding of life, death, and the relationship between humans and gods. What made Michael's case particularly fascinating was that his dream knowledge extended beyond language to include practical skills and cultural understanding. He demonstrated knowledge of ancient Egyptian mathematics, astronomy, architectural principles, and administrative procedures that weren't available in popular books about Egypt. He could explain how hieroglyphic writing systems worked, how ancient Egyptian calendars functioned, how temple construction projects were organized, and how the complex bureaucracy of pharaonic Egypt managed resources across vast territories. Michael's hieroglyphic writings revealed authentic ancient Egyptian perspectives on religion, social relationships, professional duties, and personal values. When Professor Whitfield translated his texts, he found sophisticated discussions of theological concepts, practical advice for temple administration, personal reflections on the meaning of life and death, and even love poetry that used traditional Egyptian literary conventions and emotional expressions. The most remarkable aspect of Michael's experience was that his Egyptian dream life had its own continuous narrative. Each dream episode built on previous experiences, creating an ongoing story of temple scribe Kamwasit's daily life, professional challenges, personal relationships, and spiritual development. Michael was living a complete parallel life in ancient Egypt, with consistent characters, developing relationships, and evolving understanding of Egyptian culture and religion. Professor Whitfield documented Michael's dream experiences in extraordinary detail, creating what became one of the most comprehensive records of authentic ancient Egyptian cultural knowledge produced in the modern era. Michael's hieroglyphic texts, when analyzed by teams of Egyptologists, provided insights into ancient Egyptian temple life, religious practices, social structures, and daily routines that weren't available from conventional archaeological and textual sources. The collaboration between Michael and Professor Whitfield resulted in several academic papers and eventually a book about daily life in ancient Egyptian temples that drew heavily on the cultural knowledge that Michael had accessed through his dreams. Professor Whitfield noted that Michael's insider perspective on ancient Egyptian civilization provided understanding of how Egyptian society actually functioned from the viewpoint of people who lived within it, rather than just the formal historical record preserved in official monuments and texts. But perhaps most importantly, Michael's hieroglyphic dreams demonstrated that ancient Egyptian culture wasn't just a collection of artifacts and texts to be studied by scholars. It was a living civilization with real people who had complex inner lives, personal relationships, professional challenges, and spiritual aspirations that transcended the boundaries of historical periods and cultural differences. Michael's Egyptian dream life continued for about 2 years, during which he produced hundreds of pages of hieroglyphic writing and provided Professor Whitfield with cultural insights that contributed significantly to academic understanding of ancient Egyptian society. The texts ranged from formal religious inscriptions to personal letters, administrative documents to love poetry, creating a comprehensive archive of authentic ancient Egyptian writing. that reflected the full range of human experience within that civilization. When the dreams finally stopped, Michael returned to his normal life as a construction worker, with no memory of hieroglyphic writing and no understanding of the ancient Egyptian concepts he discussed so knowledgeably during his dream episodes. He kept all the hieroglyphic texts he'd produced, even though they looked like meaningless symbols to him after his dream abilities faded, and he would sometimes stare at the beautiful inscriptions with a vague sense that they had once been deeply meaningful to him. Professor Whitfield said that working with Michael had been one of the most extraordinary experiences of his academic career, providing him with insights into ancient Egyptian culture that had fundamentally changed his understanding of how that civilization actually functioned as a living society. The hieroglyphic texts produced during Michael's dream episodes remain some of the most authentic examples of ancient Egyptian writing created in the modern era, and they continue to be studied by Egyptologists as unique windows into the daily life and cultural perspectives of ancient Egyptian people. Sometimes I wonder if Michael's story suggests that the knowledge and cultural understanding of ancient civilizations might exist in forms that transcend individual learning and historical periods, accessible through states of consciousness that allow us to temporarily experience what it was like to actually live within those cultures rather than just studying them from the outside. Our final story from this section takes us to 1961 and involves Sister Mary Catherine O'Brien, a cloistered nun in a contemplative order in rural Wisconsin who had never traveled outside the Midwest and whose only exposure to foreign languages was the Latin used in traditional Catholic liturgy. Sister Mary Catherine was living a quiet, contemplative life focused on prayer, gardening, and maintaining the peaceful routine of monastic life when something extraordinary began to unfold in her dreams. Sister Mary Catherine was the kind of nun you might find in countless American convents, devout, humble, and thoroughly dedicated to her religious vocation. She had entered the convent in 1945 at the age of 22, drawn by a genuine calling to contemplative life and a desire to serve God through prayer and simple work. Her days followed the ancient rhythms of monastic life, rising before dawn for morning prayers, attending Mass, working in the convent garden, participating in communal meals taken in silence, and spending hours in personal prayer and meditation. The Carmelite convent where Sister Mary Catherine lived was a small, traditional community that emphasized silence, prayer, and separation from the secular world. The nuns spoke only when necessary, lived simply without personal possessions, and devoted their entire lives to spiritual contemplation and service to God. Sister Mary Catherine was known among her fellow nuns for her gentle spirit, her skill in growing vegetables for the community's meals, and her deep commitment to the contemplative ideal. But starting exactly 2 weeks before Christmas in 1961, Sister Mary Catherine began having the same extraordinary dream every single night. The dream always transported her to what appeared to be medieval France, where she found herself living as a 12th century nun named Sister Marguerite in a Cistercian convent in the Loire Valley, speaking fluent Old French and participating in the daily life of medieval monastic community with complete cultural authenticity and historical accuracy. These weren't casual dreams about medieval times or romantic fantasies inspired by historical novels. They were immersive experiences where Sister Mary Catherine lived as Sister Marguerite, speaking the archaic form of French that was used in religious communities during the High Middle Ages, and demonstrating detailed knowledge of medieval monastic practices, theological concepts, social structures, and daily life that she had never studied or encountered in her modern American education. In her dreams, Sister Mary Catherine found herself in a massive stone monastery that made her Wisconsin convent look like a modest cottage. The medieval abbey was a complex of interconnected buildings surrounding a central cloister with a soaring Gothic church, chapter house, scriptorium, refectory, dormitories, and various workshops where the nuns carried out the practical work that sustained their community. The architecture was authentic in every detail, from the ribbed vaulting and flying buttresses of the church to the simple barrel vaults of the working areas. The most remarkable aspect of Sister Mary Catherine's medieval dreams was her complete fluency in Old French, Not just vocabulary and grammar, but the entire cultural and linguistic framework that made 12th century communication meaningful. She was speaking with the formal register appropriate for religious discourse, using the proper terms of address for different levels of monastic hierarchy, and demonstrating understanding of theological concepts and scriptural interpretations that reflected authentic medieval Catholic thought. When Sister Mary Catherine woke up from these dreams, she would continue speaking in Old French for several minutes, using grammatical structures and vocabulary that hadn't been commonly used for over 600 years. The other nuns were initially concerned that their sister was becoming confused or developing some kind of psychological problem, especially when she would wake up discussing medieval theological concepts using archaic French, terminology that none of them could understand. But Mother Superior Agnes, who had studied medieval history before entering religious life, recognized that Sister Mary Catherine was speaking what sounded like authentic medieval French, complete with archaic verb forms and religious terminology that indicated sophisticated knowledge of medieval monastic culture. Mother Superior Agnes had enough background in medieval studies to understand that what Sister Mary Catherine was producing wasn't random fantasy or psychological confusion. It was linguistically and culturally authentic medieval religious discourse. The situation became even more intriguing when Sister Mary Catherine started writing in Old French during her post-dream episodes, producing texts that appeared to be authentic medieval religious manuscripts, complete with proper scribal techniques and the kind of illuminated lettering that medieval monks and nuns spent years learning to create. She would wake up before dawn and spend the early morning hours writing in Old French using traditional quill and ink techniques, creating manuscripts that looked as if they had been produced in a medieval scriptorium. Mother Superior Agnes contacted Professor Henry Dubois at Marquette University, a specialist in medieval French literature and religious history, asking him to examine Sister Mary Catherine's writings and evaluate whether they represented authentic medieval language patterns. Professor Dubois was initially skeptical medieval French was his life's work, and he didn't expect to find anything authentic produced by a Wisconsin nun who had never studied the language or medieval history. But when Professor Dubois examined Sister Mary Catherine's writings and listened to recordings of her Old French speech, he was absolutely astonished. Sister Mary Catherine was demonstrating knowledge of 12th century Old French that rivaled his own expertise, using grammatical structures, vocabulary, and scribal techniques that indicated training in medieval monastic education systems that no longer existed. The Old French that Sister Mary Catherine was producing wasn't just linguistically correct, it was culturally authentic. She was using the specific dialect and register that would have been appropriate for a 12th century Cistercian nun, complete with the theological terminology, liturgical language, and monastic vocabulary that reflected deep immersion in medieval religious culture. Her pronunciation matched what scholars believed 12th century French would have sounded like, including archaic sound changes and regional variations that weren't commonly taught even in advanced medieval studies programs. But the really remarkable aspect of Sister Mary Catherine's medieval dreams was the cultural authenticity of her knowledge. She wasn't just speaking Old French, she was demonstrating understanding of medieval theology, monastic rule, liturgical practices, and daily life details that weren't available in modern books about medieval history. She could describe the specific hours of prayer that structured medieval monastic life, the procedures for manuscript copying and illumination, the hierarchies within medieval convents, and the theological debates that occupied medieval religious scholars. Professor Dubois arranged for Sister Mary Catherine to be examined by other medieval scholars, and they consistently found that her knowledge of 12th century monastic life was extraordinarily accurate and detailed. She could describe the layout of a Cistercian abbey with architectural precision, explain the differences between various medieval religious orders, discuss the economic systems that supported medieval monasteries, and analyze theological texts with the sophistication of someone who had received formal medieval education. What made Sister Mary Catherine's case particularly compelling was that her medieval knowledge wasn't just academic, it was experiential. She described medieval convent life from the inside with the kind of practical understanding that comes from actually living within medieval monastic culture rather than just reading about it in scholarly books. She knew which jobs were assigned to which nuns, how conflicts within the community were resolved, what kinds of food were available during different seasons, and how the nuns maintained their spiritual discipline while dealing with the practical challenges of medieval life. Sister Mary Catherine's dreams consistently featured the same medieval convent, a Cistercian abbey called Notre Dame de Clairvaux in the Loire Valley during the 12th century, and she always appeared as Sister Marguerite, a nun who served as the abbey's librarian and manuscript copyist. She could describe the abbey's layout in extraordinary detail, the position of altars within the church, the arrangement of desks in the scriptorium, the location of storage areas for manuscripts and writing materials, and the daily routines that governed every aspect of monastic life. In her dreams, Sister Marguerite was responsible for copying and preserving religious texts, creating illuminated manuscripts, and maintaining the abbey's library of theological and liturgical works. Sister Mary Catherine could describe the techniques used for preparing parchment, mixing inks, applying gold leaf, and creating the elaborate decorated letters that made medieval manuscripts works of art as well as religious texts. She demonstrated knowledge of Latin paleography, medieval book production, and manuscript preservation techniques that reflected professional-level expertise in medieval studies. The most extraordinary aspect of Sister Mary Catherine's medieval experiences was that her Old French writings, when analyzed by Professor Dubuis and his colleagues, revealed authentic medieval perspectives on theology, spirituality, and monastic life that provided insights into 12th century religious culture that weren't available from other historical sources. She was writing from the viewpoint of someone who actually lived within medieval monasticism, with understanding of the spiritual challenges, community dynamics, and daily realities that shaped medieval religious life. Sister Mary Catherine's medieval manuscripts included theological commentaries, personal spiritual reflections, letters to other religious communities, and administrative documents that showed how medieval convents actually functioned as religious, economic, and social institutions. Her writing revealed intimate knowledge of medieval spirituality, including the contemplative practices, theological debates, and mystical traditions that influenced medieval religious life. Professor Dubois noted that Sister Mary Catherine's medieval writings demonstrated understanding of 12th century theological controversies, monastic reform movements, and the relationship between contemplative communities and the broader medieval church that indicated extensive knowledge of medieval religious history. She was writing about specific historical events, religious figures, and theological developments with accuracy that would be impressive even for professional medieval historians. The content of Sister Mary Catherine's Old French manuscripts was particularly remarkable because it included details about medieval convent life that weren't commonly documented in official historical sources. Medieval women's religious experiences were often overlooked or minimized in formal ecclesiastical records, but Sister Mary Catherine was providing insider perspectives on how medieval nuns actually lived, worked, and maintained their spiritual communities. Her writings described the emotional and spiritual challenges that medieval nuns faced, homesickness for families they had left behind, struggles with doubt and temptation, conflicts between individual desires and communal obligations, and the difficulty of maintaining contemplative focus while dealing with practical responsibilities. These intimate insights into medieval religious psychology weren't available from conventional historical sources. Sister Mary Catherine's medieval dream life continued for about 3 years, during which she produced what scholars consider to be some of the most authentic examples of medieval French religious writing created in the modern era. Her manuscripts showed not just linguistic accuracy, but spiritual and cultural understanding that captured the essence of medieval monastic spirituality from the perspective of someone who had actually lived within that tradition. The gradual fading of Sister Mary Catherine's medieval abilities was as mysterious as their appearance. Over several months, her Old French vocabulary became more limited, her pronunciation less precise, and her knowledge of medieval theological concepts more superficial. She first lost her ability to write a medieval script. Then her understanding of complex theological texts became more limited, And finally, her pronunciation began showing the kind of errors that would be expected from someone learning Old French as a foreign language. When the dreams finally ended, Sister Mary Catherine returned to her normal contemplative life, with no memory of Old French and no understanding of the medieval theological concepts she discussed so eloquently during her dream episodes. She kept all the manuscripts she'd produced, even though she could no longer read or understand what she'd written in her medieval script. But the experience had permanently changed Sister Mary, Catherine's approach to spirituality and her understanding of the contemplative tradition. She became much more interested in the historical development of monastic spirituality, though she approached these interests through conventional study rather than through the direct access to medieval consciousness that had characterized her dream experiences. Her fellow nuns noted that her personal prayer life seemed to have gained depth and authenticity, as if her temporary connection to medieval monasticism had enriched her understanding of what contemplative life could be. Professor Dubois said that Sister Mary Catherine's medieval writings had contributed significantly to scholarly understanding of 12th century monastic culture, particularly the religious experiences of medieval women. Her manuscripts provided insights into the daily spiritual practices, community relationships, and theological understanding of medieval nuns that weren't available from formal ecclesiastical sources or male-authored accounts of medieval religious life. The case became significant in medieval studies as an example of how experiential knowledge of historical periods might be accessed through states of consciousness that transcend normal temporal boundaries. Sister Mary Catherine's authentic understanding of medieval spirituality suggested that the contemplative traditions of different historical periods might be connected through forms of spiritual experience that aren't limited by chronological time. Sister Mary Catherine continued to live as a contemplative nun for another 30 years, never again experiencing medieval dreams or demonstrating knowledge of Old French. But her fellow sisters noted that she retained something indefinable from her medieval experiences, a quality of spiritual depth and historical awareness that seemed to come from having actually lived within the contemplative tradition rather than just studying it intellectually. The manuscripts that Sister Mary Catherine produced during her medieval dream episodes are preserved in the archives at Marquette University, where they continue to be studied by medieval scholars as unique examples of authentic medieval religious consciousness expressed through modern dream experiences. They remain some of the most intimate and psychologically authentic accounts of medieval, monastic life available to contemporary researchers. Sometimes I wonder if Sister Mary Catherine's story suggests that the contemplative traditions of different historical periods are connected through forms of spiritual consciousness that transcend individual lifetimes and historical boundaries. Maybe the deepest levels of religious experience allow access to the accumulated wisdom and spiritual understanding of all the contemplatives who have ever lived, regardless of when or where they practiced their devotion to the sacred. Now, not all linguistic dream mysteries involve ancient or foreign languages that actually existed. Sometimes people dream in languages that never existed at all, invented tongues that follow their own internal logic and grammar rules, suggesting that our sleeping minds might be capable of creating entirely new forms of human communication from scratch. In 1975, Dr. Patricia Wells, a pediatric nurse from Portland, Oregon, started having dreams where everyone spoke in a language that sounded completely foreign, but somehow felt as familiar as her native English. This wasn't gibberish or random sounds. It was a consistent, structured language with its own grammar rules, vocabulary, and even what appeared to be regional dialects and social registers that indicated different levels of formality and cultural context. Dr. Wells was a practical, no-nonsense medical professional who spent her days caring for sick children at Portland General Hospital. Her world revolved around medical terminology, patient care protocols, and the endless administrative demands of modern healthcare. She had no background in linguistics, no interest in constructed languages, and certainly no experience creating fictional languages for fantasy novels or academic research. But in her dreams, Dr. Wells found herself living in what appeared to be a completely realized alternative civilization, where everyone communicated in this invented language that her sleeping mind had somehow created. The dream world had its own geography, social structures, cultural practices, and historical traditions, all expressed through linguistic patterns that were internally consistent but unlike any natural human language that had ever existed. Dr. Wells would wake up from these dreams speaking fluently in this invented language, carrying on conversations with imaginary people and demonstrating complex grammatical structures that remained consistent from dream to dream. Her husband started recording these episodes, and when linguists later analyzed the recordings, they found that Dr. Wells had somehow created a complete language system with rules and patterns as sophisticated as any natural human language. The invented language had its own syntax that differed significantly from English, word order patterns that followed internal logic, morphological systems for indicating grammatical relationships, and phonological patterns that were internally consistent but unlike the sound systems of any known language family. Dr. Wells was essentially dreaming her way into being a native speaker of a language that existed only in her sleeping mind. What made this case particularly fascinating was that the dream language evolved over time, developing new vocabulary and grammatical structures as Dr. Wells continued to dream in it. She was unconsciously creating not just a language, but a living, growing linguistic system that adapted and changed according to its own internal logic, much like natural languages evolve over generations of speakers. The vocabulary of Dr. Wells' invented language reflected the cultural concepts and social structures of her dream civilization. She had words for social relationships, emotional states, and cultural practices that didn't exist in her waking world, suggesting that her sleeping mind was not just creating language, but inventing entire cultural frameworks that required new forms of expression. Linguists who studied Dr. Wells' dream language found that it included features common to natural human languages, things like vowel harmony, consonant clusters, and grammatical patterns that occur frequently across different language families, but combined in ways that created a unique linguistic system that had never existed in any real human society. The most remarkable aspect of Dr. Wells' invented language was that it seemed to have its own literature, oral traditions, and cultural knowledge. In her dreams, she could recite poetry, tell traditional stories, and discuss historical events from her dream civilization, all in her invented language that demonstrated the kind of cultural depth and emotional resonance that typically develops over centuries of linguistic and cultural evolution. After about 18 months, Dr. Wells' dream language episodes gradually faded, and she returned to dreaming in English like everyone else. But during the time when she was actively creating and speaking her invented language, she produced what linguists consider to be one of the most sophisticated examples of unconscious language creation ever documented, suggesting that human consciousness might have far greater capacity for linguistic creativity than we normally realize. In 1983, James McDougall, a third-generation Scottish-American living in Boston, started having dreams where he found himself in the Scottish Highlands, speaking fluent Scottish Gaelic with people who appeared to be his ancestors from centuries past. What made this extraordinary was that James had grown up in an assimilated Irish-American family and had never learned Gaelic or shown any particular interest in Scottish culture beyond the occasional Highland Games festival. James's grandparents had immigrated from Scotland in the early 1900s, but like many immigrants of their generation, they had deliberately abandoned their native language to better integrate into American society. They spoke only English in their Boston home, believing that maintaining Old World languages would handicap their children's success in their new country. By the time James was born, Gaelic had become nothing more than a romantic memory mentioned occasionally during family stories about the old country. James worked as an accountant for a Boston insurance company, lived in a modest suburban apartment, and his main connection to Scottish heritage was wearing a McDougall tartan tie to the annual St. Patrick's Day parade, though he was usually too busy with tax season to participate in cultural events anyway. His knowledge of Scotland came mainly from tourist brochures and the occasional movie featuring men in kilts, not from any deep cultural education or linguistic training. But in his dreams, James found himself completely immersed in Highland life, speaking Gaelic with the fluency of someone who had grown up in a traditional Scottish community. He wasn't just understanding basic phrases or tourist expressions. He was participating in complex conversations about clan politics, seasonal farming practices, traditional music, and the kind of intimate family relationships that require sophisticated vocabulary and cultural understanding. The Gaelic that James spoke in his dreams wasn't modern Scottish Gaelic taught in contemporary language classes, but an archaic Highland dialect that reflected the way the language had been spoken before the Highland. Clearances and mass emigration had disrupted traditional Scottish communities. His pronunciation included subtle regional variations that linguists later identified as characteristic of specific Highland areas where the MacDougall clan had historically lived. In his dreams, James had a clear identity as Sumas MacDougall, a young crofter living in Glen Orkney during the 18th century, before the clan system had been destroyed by English political and military intervention. He knew his place in complex kinship networks, understood traditional Highland social structures, and participated in seasonal celebrations and clan gatherings with complete cultural authenticity. James would wake up from these dreams still speaking Gaelic, often continuing conversations with dream characters for several minutes before his English-speaking consciousness returned. His wife, Margaret, was initially concerned that her husband was having some kind of psychological breakdown, especially when he started discussing Highland cattle breeding and traditional weaving techniques, using vocabulary she'd never heard before. When Celtic language specialists at Boston College analyzed recordings of James's sleep talking, they confirmed that he was speaking authentic 18th century Highland, Gaelic with pronunciation patterns and grammatical structures that matched historical records of how the language had sounded before modern standardization efforts. He was using archaic vocabulary, traditional storytelling formulas, and cultural references that weren't available in modern Scottish Gaelic learning materials. The most remarkable aspect of James's Gaelic dreams was that they included traditional stories, songs, and cultural knowledge that had been passed down through oral tradition in Scottish Highland communities but had never been written down or recorded by scholars. He was somehow accessing cultural memory that existed only in the collective consciousness of Gaelic speakers whose families had maintained these traditions across generations of cultural disruption. One particularly moving session occurred when James, while in a post-dream state, recited a traditional lament that Celtic music scholars immediately recognized as an authentic Highland morning song that hadn't been performed publicly for over a century. The song included verses and melodic variations that existed only in the memories of elderly Gaelic speakers whose families had preserved these musical traditions despite centuries of cultural suppression. James's dream experiences continued for about a year, during which he developed such authentic Gaelic fluency that Celtic scholars invited him to participate in academic conferences about Highland culture and traditional Scottish oral literature. His insights into 18th century Highland life, based on his dream experiences as Sumas MacDougall, contributed to scholarly understanding of how traditional Scottish communities had functioned before their destruction during the Highland clearances. Eventually, James's Gaelic dream episodes faded, but the experience had permanently changed his relationship with his Scottish heritage. He enrolled in formal Gaelic language classes, became active in Scottish cultural organizations, and developed a deep appreciation for the traditional Highland culture that his grandparents had abandoned in their eagerness to become American. James often reflected that his dreams had given him access to ancestral knowledge and cultural identity that his family had lost through the immigrant experience, connecting him to a way of life and language that had been suppressed by historical forces but continued to exist in some form of collective cultural memory accessible through dreams. Perhaps one of the most unusual linguistic dream cases involved Rebecca Martinez, a hearing woman from Phoenix who in 1979 started having dreams where she communicated entirely through American Sign Language, a visual language she had never learned and had rarely encountered in her daily life. What makes Rebecca's case particularly intriguing is that she was born hearing and had grown up in a predominantly Spanish-speaking household where sign language was completely unknown. Rebecca worked as a graphic designer for a small advertising agency in Phoenix, spending her days creating visual layouts and artwork for print advertisements. Her world revolved around visual communication, but only in the context of commercial design, typography, color theory, and visual composition for marketing materials. She had no background in linguistics, no exposure to deaf communities, and certainly no training in sign language beyond a single introductory course she'd taken in college to fulfill a foreign language requirement. But in her dreams, Rebecca found herself immersed in communities of deaf people, using ASL to participate in complex conversations about philosophy, politics, personal relationships, and cultural issues that were important to deaf communities. She wasn't struggling to communicate or feeling like an outsider. She was fluently signing with the same natural ease that hearing people use spoken language, demonstrating knowledge of ASL grammar, vocabulary, and cultural conventions that would typically require years of study and immersion in deaf communities. The ASL that Rebecca used in her dreams wasn't just basic conversational signing or the kind of simple phrases that hearing people might learn in introductory courses. She was using sophisticated grammatical structures unique to ASL, things like classifier constructions, spatial referencing, and non-manual markers that indicate the kind of deep linguistic competence that usually comes from growing up within deaf culture or receiving extensive professional training in sign language interpretation. When Rebecca woke up from these dreams, she would continue signing for several minutes before her normal hearing consciousness returned, often carrying on conversations with dream characters while her husband watched in bewilderment. She would sign complex narratives, emotional expressions, and cultural commentary that impressed professional ASL interpreters who later examined videos of her sleep signing episodes. Rebecca's dream ASL included specialized vocabulary related to deaf culture, deaf history, and the specific social and political issues that are important to deaf communities, concepts like deaf pride, the controversy over cochlear implants, the importance of ASL as a complete natural language rather than just a manual code for English, and the cultural identity that develops within deaf communities. This suggested that her dreams were providing access not just to a language, but to an entire cultural worldview and community experience. What made Rebecca's case particularly remarkable was that her signing wasn't just technically correct, it was culturally authentic. She understood the social context where different types of signing would be appropriate, the proper etiquette for getting someone's attention in visual communication, and the cultural values that shape how deaf communities interact with each other and with the hearing world around them. Professional ASL interpreters who worked with Rebecca were amazed by the natural rhythm and flow of her signing, the appropriate use of facial expressions and body language that give ASL its grammatical structure, and her understanding of the spatial aspects of the language that allow signers to establish multiple reference points and maintain complex narrative threads through three-dimensional visual communication. The deaf community members who observed Rebecca's signing said that her communication felt authentic and respectful, showing the kind of cultural understanding that usually comes from meaningful relationships within deaf communities rather than just academic study of ASL as a foreign language. They noted that her signing reflected genuine appreciation for deaf culture and values, rather than the sometimes patronizing approach that hearing people bring to sign language learning. Rebecca's ASL dreams often involved scenarios where she was advocating for deaf rights, participating in deaf cultural events, and engaging with the kinds of social and political issues that are central to deaf community life. She would dream about attending deaf schools, participating in deaf theater performances, and having the kind of deep cultural conversations about identity, language, and community that reflect authentic insider perspectives on deaf experience. The most profound aspect of Rebecca's dream experiences was that they changed her understanding of what language could be and how human communication works. Through her dreams, she learned that language isn't limited to sounds and speech. It can be entirely visual, using space, movement, facial expression, and gesture to create communication systems that are just as complete and sophisticated as any spoken language. Rebecca's sign language dreams continued for about 2 years, during which she became increasingly interested in deaf culture and ASL linguistics. She started taking formal ASL classes, volunteering with deaf community organizations, and eventually changed her career focus to specialize in visual communication design for deaf and hard-of-hearing audiences. Even after her dream signing abilities faded, Rebecca maintained her connection to the deaf community and became an advocate for deaf rights and ASL recognition. She often said that her dreams had taught her that communication transcends the boundaries of hearing and deafness, and that visual languages like ASL offer insights into human communication that expand our understanding of what language can be. Rebecca's case remains one of the most documented examples of spontaneous sign language acquisition through dreams, challenging conventional understanding of how visual languages are learned and suggesting that human consciousness might have access to forms of communication that transcend the sensory modalities we typically associate with language learning. In 1968, Professor Robert Williams, a mathematics instructor at a small college in Vermont, began having dreams where he found himself in ancient Athens, participating in philosophical discussions with figures who appeared to be classical Greek philosophers, speaking fluent ancient Greek and demonstrating sophisticated knowledge of classical philosophical concepts that had nothing to do with his mathematical background or professional expertise. Professor Williams was a practical man who taught calculus and statistics to undergraduates at Middlebury College. His world revolved around equations, proofs, and the kind of logical thinking that mathematics requires, not the abstract philosophical discussions that had occupied ancient Greek thinkers. He had studied Latin in high school but had never learned Greek and had no particular expertise in classical philosophy, ancient history, or the intellectual traditions that had flourished in ancient Athens. His academic training was entirely in mathematics and mathematical education. He could solve complex differential equations and explain statistical principles to confused students, but he couldn't read a single word of ancient Greek text and wouldn't have been able to distinguish between different schools of Greek philosophical thought if his life depended on it. His idea of deep philosophical discussion was debating whether pure mathematics or applied mathematics was more important for undergraduate education. But in his dreams, Professor Williams found himself completely immersed in the intellectual culture of classical Athens, participating in the kind of sophisticated philosophical discussions that had shaped Western thought for over 2,000 years. He wasn't just observing these conversations or struggling to keep up. He was an active participant, speaking ancient Greek with perfect fluency and demonstrating understanding of complex philosophical concepts that he had never studied in his waking life. The dreams always took place in recognizable locations from ancient Athens, sometimes in the agora, where philosophers would gather to debate ideas with anyone who was interested, sometimes in the academy that Plato had founded for advanced philosophical education, and sometimes in private homes where small groups of intellectuals would meet for intimate discussions about the nature of reality, knowledge, and human existence. In these dreams, Professor Williams engaged in detailed philosophical debates with figures who appeared to be Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and other major Greek philosophers, discussing concepts like the nature of justice, the relationship between knowledge and virtue, the proper organization of society, and the fundamental questions about reality that had occupied Greek thinkers for centuries. He wasn't just listening to these discussions. He was contributing original insights and asking the kind of probing questions that demonstrated genuine philosophical sophistication. When Professor Williams woke up from these dreams, he would continue speaking ancient Greek for several minutes, using proper classical pronunciation and grammatical structures that matched what scholars believed ancient Greek had actually sounded like in classical Athens. His wife would find him in his study, discussing complex metaphysical concepts in a language he couldn't read or understand during his normal waking hours. Classical scholars who examined Professor Williams's dream Greek found that he was using authentic ancient Greek vocabulary, including specialized philosophical terminology and grammatical constructions that weren't commonly taught even in graduate-level classics programs. He was employing technical terms from different schools of Greek philosophy, understanding the subtle distinctions between concepts like episteme and doxa, knowledge and opinion, or orate and keikos, virtue and vice, that required deep familiarity with Greek philosophical traditions. But what made Professor Williams's case truly extraordinary was that his philosophical discussions in ancient Greek showed genuine understanding of classical Greek thought, not just linguistic accuracy. He was engaging with philosophical concepts and argumentative techniques that demonstrated comprehension of how ancient Greek philosophers actually approached fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, ethics, and political organization. Professor Williams could discuss the differences between Platonic idealism and Aristotelian empiricism, analyze the logical structure of Socratic questioning, and engage with pre-Socratic theories about the fundamental nature of reality in ways that showed authentic, philosophical understanding rather than just memorized information. He was thinking like an ancient Greek philosopher, using their conceptual frameworks and argumentative strategies with the kind of natural facility that suggested genuine intellectual immersion in their worldview. The content of Professor Williams's dream discussions revealed knowledge of Greek philosophical texts and traditions that weren't available in English translation and certainly weren't part of standard undergraduate education in mathematics. He was referencing obscure philosophical arguments, quoting from texts that existed only in specialized academic collections, and demonstrating familiarity with the historical development of Greek philosophical schools that would impress professional classicists. One particularly remarkable session occurred when Professor Williams, while still in his post-dream Greek-speaking state, delivered what appeared to be an original philosophical argument about the relationship between mathematical truth and philosophical knowledge, combining ancient Greek philosophical concepts with insights from modern mathematical thinking in ways that created genuinely novel intellectual synthesis. Classical philosophers who examined transcripts of Professor Williams's dream discussions noted that his approach to philosophical questions reflected authentic ancient Greek intellectual methods, the careful definition of terms, the systematic examination of assumptions, the use of analogies and thought experiments to illuminate abstract concepts, and the commitment to following logical arguments wherever they might lead, even when the conclusions challenged conventional beliefs. Professor Williams's ancient Greek dream episodes continued for about 2 years, during which he produced what classicists considered to be some of the most authentic examples of ancient Greek philosophical discourse created in the modern era. His dream discussions provided insights into how ancient Greek philosophers actually thought and argued that weren't available from surviving historical texts or modern academic reconstructions of ancient philosophical methods. The experience permanently changed Professor Williams's approach to mathematics education, even though he never learned to read ancient Greek in his waking life. He began incorporating philosophical questions about the nature of mathematical truth into his teaching, encouraging students to think about the relationship between mathematical knowledge and other forms of human understanding in ways that reflected the influence of his dream, encounters with ancient Greek philosophical traditions. When his Greek dream abilities eventually faded, Professor Williams retained no conscious memory of ancient Greek language or philosophy, but colleagues noted that his approach to mathematical thinking had gained a depth and sophistication that seemed to come from exposure to the kind of rigorous intellectual discipline that had characterized classical Greek philosophical education. Professor Williams often reflected that his dreams had taught him that mathematical and philosophical thinking weren't separate intellectual activities but complementary approaches to understanding the fundamental structure of reality, an insight that connected his modern mathematical expertise with the ancient Greek conviction that mathematics and philosophy were inseparable aspects of the search for truth. Throughout history, different cultures have had fascinating interpretations of what it means to dream in languages you've never learned. And these ancient perspectives might be more sophisticated than our modern scientific skepticism gives them credit for. The more you learn about how our ancestors understood linguistic dreams, the more you realize that maybe our contemporary dismissal of these phenomena isn't necessarily more advanced. It might just be more limited in its scope and imagination. In ancient Egypt, dreams involving unknown languages were considered direct messages from the gods, delivered in the sacred tongues of different deities who govern various aspects of human life and cosmic order. Egyptian dream interpreters believed that the human soul could travel to divine realms during sleep, where it would naturally understand and speak the languages of various gods and goddesses who communicated important information about the future, the afterlife, and the proper conduct of earthly affairs. The Egyptians took this belief so seriously that they built their entire spiritual and political system around it. They had massive temple complexes dedicated to dream interpretation, where people would travel hundreds of miles hoping to receive visions of the future expressed in divine languages they couldn't normally understand. These weren't small shrines tucked away in forgotten corners. We're talking about elaborate institutional structures with dedicated priests, sophisticated rituals, and detailed procedures that were passed down through generations of religious specialists. Egyptian priests developed complex theological frameworks for understanding how linguistic dreams worked. They believed that during sleep, the Ka, the spiritual double that could move freely through different dimensions while the physical body rested, would visit the realm of the gods, where past, present, and future existed simultaneously in a timeless cosmic consciousness. In this divine realm, the Ka could gather information that wasn't available to the waking mind and bring back glimpses of what was to come, expressed in the sacred languages that the gods used for communication with mortals. The Egyptians documented thousands of prophetic dreams in hieroglyphics, creating what was essentially the world's first database of precognitive experiences involving unknown languages. These weren't casual mentions or folklore, they were official records kept by temple scribes, complete with dates, names, witnesses, and follow-up reports about whether the linguistic dreams had come true and what their divine messages had meant for individuals and communities. Many of these records were remarkably accurate, describing everything from military victories and defeats to natural disasters and royal successions, all originally received through dreams and languages that the dreamers didn't normally speak. Pharaohs made major political and military decisions based on dreams, both their own and those of their designated dream interpreters who specialized in understanding divine communication through unknown tongues. The famous story of Pharaoh's dream about 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows, interpreted by Joseph as 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine, was taken so seriously that it shaped economic policy for 14 years. According to historical records, the prophecy was completely accurate, and Egypt's preparation based on this linguistic dream allowed them to survive the famine while neighboring civilizations struggled with crop failures and social upheaval. But the Egyptians didn't just passively wait for prophetic dreams to happen randomly. They developed sophisticated techniques for inducing them, including sleeping in sacred chambers specifically designed to enhance divine communication, fasting and meditation practices that prepared the Ka for spiritual travel, and consuming specific herbs that were believed to enhance dream visions and make the soul more receptive to divine languages. The Greeks and Romans had similar beliefs about linguistic dreams, but they developed more systematic approaches to understanding how this divine communication worked. Greek dream interpreters distinguished between dreams involving languages the dreamer had heard before versus completely unknown tongues, believing that truly foreign dream languages indicated prophecies or messages from distant lands that required special interpretation techniques. Greek scholars created detailed classification systems for different types of prophetic visions, distinguishing between dreams that showed events exactly as they would happen versus dreams that used symbolic language requiring careful analysis and interpretation. They also categorized dreams by their source. Some came from gods, others from the souls of the dead, and still others from the dreamer's own divine nature that could access universal knowledge during altered states of consciousness. Roman military commanders documented numerous cases of soldiers dreaming in the languages of enemy peoples before battles, which they interpreted as strategic intelligence provided by the gods who wanted to ensure Roman victory. These linguistic dreams were taken so seriously that commanders would delay battles or change tactics based on the foreign languages their soldiers reported hearing in prophetic dreams. Hindu and Buddhist traditions developed even more sophisticated theories about linguistic dreams, rooted in complex philosophies about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to universal knowledge that transcends individual experience and cultural boundaries. Hindu philosophers believe that individual consciousness is connected to Brahman, a universal consciousness that contains all possible knowledge, including every language that has ever existed or could ever exist in any realm of reality. According to this theory, during deep sleep, when the ego is quiet and personal identity is temporarily dissolved, individual consciousness can sometimes merge with this universal awareness and access linguistic knowledge that exists beyond personal experience and cultural learning. This explains not just dreaming in foreign languages, but also cases where people dream in invented languages or ancient tongues that are no longer spoken by any living person. Buddhist monks developed specific meditation techniques designed to access these universal language states, believing that linguistic dreams were signs of progress in spiritual development toward enlightenment. Advanced practitioners reported being able to dream in Sanskrit, Pali, and other sacred languages that they had never formally studied, as well as in completely invented languages that seemed to emerge from deeper levels of consciousness that transcended normal human experience. Modern neuroscience offers several fascinating theories about how linguistic dreams might work, though we're still far from having complete explanations for the cases we've explored tonight. One compelling possibility is that our brains are constantly processing much more linguistic information than we consciously realize, storing fragments of overheard conversations, foreign movies, unfamiliar accents, and cultural patterns in unconscious memory systems that can be accessed during altered states of consciousness. During REM sleep, when the brain is consolidating memories and processing information from the day, these unconscious linguistic fragments might be reassembled into more complete language systems through the brain's extraordinary capacity for pattern recognition and extrapolation. What feels like fluency in a foreign language might actually be the sleeping mind's sophisticated ability to construct complete grammatical systems from limited linguistic data gathered through subliminal exposure. This theory could explain cases like our Latin-speaking farm boy or the Sanskrit dreaming priest, both of whom had been exposed to fragments of these languages through religious contexts that they're sleeping. Brains might have been able to reconstruct into more complete linguistic competence. But the pattern recognition theory doesn't fully explain cases involving completely invented languages or extremely obscure dialects that the dreamers couldn't possibly have encountered through any normal means. Some researchers have proposed that linguistic dreams might involve access to what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, a shared psychological space that contains the accumulated knowledge and experience of humanity, including linguistic patterns and cultural understanding that exist beyond individual learning and personal experience. According to this theory, languages exist not just as individual skills, but as collective human achievements that are somehow accessible to all human consciousness under certain circumstances that we don't yet fully understand. Linguistic dreams might represent temporary access to this collective linguistic knowledge, allowing individuals to tap into languages and cultural understanding that exist in the shared human experience of communication and meaning-making. The most speculative theories suggest that consciousness might operate according to principles we haven't discovered yet, possibly involving quantum mechanical effects that allow access to information that exists outside the normal boundaries of space and time, including linguistic knowledge from different historical periods, or even potential languages that don't yet exist but could develop in possible futures. What's clear is that linguistic dreams challenge our basic assumptions about how language learning works, how memory functions, and what kinds of knowledge are accessible to human consciousness under extraordinary circumstances that we're only beginning to understand and investigate scientifically. Before we drift off for the night, let me share a few lesser-known stories about linguistic dreams that most people have never heard, cases that are somehow even stranger than the famous ones, and that suggest the phenomenon of dreaming in unknown languages might be more common and more mysterious than we think. In 1934, a group of children at St. Catherine's Orphanage in Dublin started having shared dreams where they all spoke the same invented language. Night after night, different children would wake up speaking identical phrases in a tongue that none of them had heard before, but that they all somehow understood perfectly. The nuns who ran the orphanage were initially terrified, thinking the children were possessed or had been exposed to some kind of foreign influence that was corrupting their Catholic upbringing. But when Father McKenna, a linguist from Trinity College, was brought in to examine the phenomenon, he discovered something extraordinary. The children weren't just babbling random sounds or making up nonsensical words. They had created a complete language system with consistent grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation rules that remained the same across multiple children's dreams. Over 50 vocabulary words and basic grammatical patterns were documented as identical across different children who had no opportunity to coordinate their stories. The shared dream language had its own syntax that was unlike English or Irish, its own phonological patterns that didn't match any European language family, and its own semantic structures that suggested a completely different way of organizing reality through linguistic categories. The children could use this dream language to discuss complex concepts, express emotions, and communicate abstract ideas with the same facility they used English during their waking hours. What made the situation even more mysterious was that the children reported dreaming about the same imaginary country where this language was spoken. They described similar landscapes, cultural practices, and social structures that suggested they were somehow accessing the same alternative reality through their shared dream experiences. The invented language wasn't just linguistic creativity, it came with an entire cultural framework that multiple children were accessing independently through their sleep. The shared dream language lasted for about 6 months before gradually fading away, leaving the children with no memory of what they had been saying or how they had all learned the same imaginary tongue. Father McKenna published a detailed study of the phenomenon, but his academic colleagues dismissed it as collective fantasy or unconscious imitation among institutionalized children. There's an even stranger case from 1952 involving twin sisters in rural Montana who developed what their family called sleep talking. They would have entire conversations in an unknown language while both were asleep, apparently responding to each other and carrying on complex dialogues in a tongue that linguists later determined had consistent grammatical structure and sophisticated vocabulary that evolved over time. The twins, Sarah and Mary O'Brien, lived on an isolated ranch with their parents and had limited contact with people outside their immediate family. They spoke only English during their waking hours and showed no interest in foreign languages or cultures. But almost every night, usually around 2 a.m., they would begin conversing in their sleep using a language that sounded vaguely Slavic, but didn't match any known European language family. Their conversations could last for hours, with each twin responding appropriately to what the other had said, asking questions, expressing disagreement, laughing at jokes, and maintaining the kind of natural dialogue rhythm that indicates genuine communication rather than random sleep talking. When one twin was awakened during an episode, she would continue speaking the unknown language for several minutes before returning to English with no memory of what she had been discussing. Linguists from the University of Montana who studied recordings of the twins' sleep conversations found evidence of shared vocabulary, consistent pronunciation patterns, and grammatical structures that suggested they were both accessing the same linguistic system through their dreams. The language appeared to have its own rules for verb conjugation, noun declension, and sentence structure that remained consistent across multiple recorded sessions. The twin sleep language included specialized vocabulary for concepts and relationships that didn't exist in their waking world, words for social roles, emotional states, and cultural practices that suggested they were communicating about experiences from some alternative reality that they shared only during sleep. They had terms for different types of kinship relationships, ceremonial activities, and spiritual concepts that reflected a completely different cultural framework from their Montana ranch life. In 1963, a night nurse at a psychiatric hospital in Vermont reported that several patients with different mental health conditions began speaking the same unidentified language during their sleep. These patients had no contact with each other during waking hours. They were housed in different wards, had different daily schedules, and were being treated for completely unrelated psychological conditions ranging from depression to schizophrenia. But during late-night rounds, Nurse Elizabeth Harrison noticed that patients in different parts of the hospital were producing similar sounds and word patterns during sleep episodes that seemed to indicate shared linguistic knowledge. When she started recording these incidents, linguists found evidence of shared vocabulary and grammatical structures that suggested the patients were all accessing the same linguistic system through their dreams. The psychiatric patients' shared dream language included complex theological and philosophical concepts that seemed inappropriate for people suffering from serious mental health conditions. They discussed metaphysical questions, ethical principles, and spiritual practices using sophisticated vocabulary and argumentative techniques that indicated intellectual capabilities that weren't evident during their normal waking interactions with hospital staff. Dr. Richard Steinberg, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, initially dismissed the phenomenon as coincidental sleep disturbances, but when the shared language episodes continued for several months and began, including patients who were admitted to the hospital after the phenomenon had begun, he started documenting the cases more seriously. The shared dream language seemed to be spreading among psychiatric patients through some mechanism that didn't involve normal conscious communication. Perhaps the most mysterious case involved a linguistics professor at Oxford University who in 1971 started dreaming in a language that she gradually realized was a complete, systematic reversal of English, not just words spelled backwards, but an entire linguistic system where grammar, syntax, and meaning patterns were inverted according to complex but consistent rules that her sleeping mind had somehow developed. Professor Margaret Thornfield was a specialist in historical linguistics who had spent her career studying how languages change over time through regular sound shifts and grammatical modifications. She was familiar with dozens of European languages and understood the systematic principles that govern linguistic evolution across different language families. But nothing in her professional training had prepared her for the experience of dreaming in a language that was essentially English turned inside out. In her reverse English dreams, Professor Thornfield found herself in familiar Oxford, environments where everyone communicated using grammatical structures that were mirror images of normal English patterns. Subjects and objects were reversed, verb tenses indicated opposite temporal relationships, and semantic meanings were systematically inverted in ways that created a coherent but completely backwards linguistic system. When she woke up from these dreams, Professor Thornfield could speak and write fluently in this reverse English, producing texts that followed consistent internal rules while maintaining strange mirror relationships to normal English structure. Other linguists who studied her productions found that she had unconsciously created a sophisticated linguistic system that demonstrated remarkable creativity, while revealing deep understanding of how English grammar actually works. The reverse English wasn't just mechanical inversion of normal patterns. It was a complete reimagining of how English could be structured if its fundamental organizational principles were systematically reversed. Professor Thornfield's sleeping mind had essentially conducted an advanced linguistic experiment that revealed hidden structural possibilities within English that weren't apparent through normal conscious analysis. There's a documented case from 1945 of a monastery in France where several monks reported dreaming in what they described as the language of angels, a melodic, flowing tongue that felt familiar and sacred but bore no resemblance to any earthly language they knew. The monks independently described similar vocabulary and grammatical patterns, and they began incorporating phrases from their angel language dreams into their private prayers and meditation practices. Brother Antoine, the monastery's scriptorium, started writing down the angelic phrases that appeared in multiple monks' dreams, creating what became a substantial vocabulary of the celestial language that seemed to be accessed by different individuals through similar mystical dream experiences. The angelic language had its own spiritual and theological concepts that weren't expressed in Latin or French, suggesting that it came with its own religious framework rather than just being a translation of familiar Christian ideas. The most compelling aspect of the angelic language dreams was that they seemed to provide direct access to mystical knowledge and spiritual experiences that enhanced the monks' contemplative practice and deepened their understanding of Christian spirituality. The unknown language wasn't just linguistic curiosity, it was a vehicle for religious insight and spiritual transformation that influenced the monastery's approach to prayer and meditation. In 1959, a group of Native American teenagers attending a boarding school in Oklahoma started having dreams where they spoke in what tribal elders later identified as an archaic form of their ancestral language that hadn't been spoken for over a century. These young people had been raised speaking only English and had never been taught their traditional language, which had been systematically suppressed by government education policies designed to erase indigenous cultural identity. But in their dreams, the teenagers were fluent in traditional vocabulary, ceremonial language, and cultural concepts that their great-grandparents would have recognized as authentic expressions of tribal identity and spiritual understanding. They were accessing not just language, but entire cultural frameworks that had been lost through forced assimilation, but somehow continued to exist in forms of consciousness that transcended individual learning and cultural disruption. The tribal elders who worked with these young dreamers said that hearing their ancestral language spoken with such authenticity was like witnessing the resurrection of cultural knowledge that they had thought was lost forever. The teenagers' dreams suggested that indigenous languages and cultural understanding might persist in forms that survive even the most systematic attempts at cultural destruction and forced assimilation. Sometimes I wonder if these obscure cases reveal something profound about the nature of human consciousness and our connection to language that goes beyond individual learning and cultural transmission. Maybe there are aspects of linguistic knowledge that exist in forms we don't yet understand, accessible through states of consciousness that we're only beginning to explore and document scientifically. If you're somehow still awake, which honestly would surprise me at this point, you've just taken a journey through some of the most mysterious linguistic phenomena in recorded human history. We've explored cases that challenge everything we think we know about how language works, how memory functions, and what kinds of knowledge are accessible to human consciousness when we slip into those strange territories. We visit every night, from medieval farm boys speaking perfect Latin to modern construction workers writing authentic hieroglyphics, from Irish-American women fluently discussing Chinese philosophy to Catholic priests chanting Sanskrit hymns. These stories suggest that the boundaries between individual minds and collective human knowledge might be more fluid than we usually imagine. Maybe our sleeping consciousness can occasionally access linguistic understanding that exists beyond personal experience and cultural learning. We've heard about people dreaming in languages that never existed, sharing invented tongues with strangers they've never met, and accessing ancient dialects that haven't been spoken for centuries. These cases remind us that language isn't just a tool for communication, it's a living connection to cultural knowledge, historical memory, and forms of human understanding that transcend the boundaries of individual lifetimes and geographical locations. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you've ever had dreams involving languages you don't speak, or found yourself understanding foreign conversations in ways that surprised you, drop those experiences in the comments. These linguistic mysteries remind us that consciousness might be capable of things we haven't even begun to understand. Maybe tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you'll find yourself in conversations using languages you've never learned. Or perhaps you'll discover that your dreaming mind has access to forms of communication that exist beyond the boundaries of any earthly tongue. Maybe you'll speak with ancestors in forgotten dialects, debate philosophy in ancient Greek, or invent entirely new ways of expressing thoughts and feelings that don't exist in any waking language. Language doesn't just happen to you in dreams. It flows through you like water finding its natural course, connecting you to the vast river of human expression that has been flowing for thousands of years across countless cultures and civilizations. In our dreams, we might touch something universal about human communication, something that transcends the specific languages we happen to speak during our waking hours. These stories suggest that the human capacity for language might be far more mysterious and expansive than we normally realize. Maybe we're all connected to forms of linguistic knowledge that exist in dimensions of consciousness we rarely access, available to us when our normal boundaries dissolve, and we become open to experiences that challenge our assumptions about what's possible. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these strange expeditions through the mysteries of human consciousness. We'll be back next week with another exploration of the weird, wonderful, and sometimes unsettling ways that our sleeping minds connect us to knowledge and experiences that shouldn't be possible according to everything we think we know about how the mind works. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes our dreams speak to us in languages we don't recognize, carrying messages from places we've never been and times we've never lived through. Sometimes the most profound conversations happen in tongues we've never learned, in the universal language that connects all human consciousness when we're brave enough to listen. Maybe the boundaries between different languages, different cultures, and different historical periods are more permeable than we usually assume. Maybe consciousness itself is multilingual in ways we're only beginning to discover. See you in your dreams, and who knows what language you'll be speaking when you get there.